the ominous original ending. Jesus Christ's resurrection from the dead, 3 days after his execution through crucifixion, is an especially important aspect of modern Christianity. Most people are familiar with this story, often retold around the holidays of Good Friday and Easter Sunday, or through films like The Passion of the Christ. The Gospels each provide slightly discrepant accounts of how, after Jesus' death, his body was placed in a tomb which was sealed by a large stone. A group of 3 or 2 or a single woman, depending on which gospel you are reading, visits the tomb and finds that the massive stone has been rolled away and Jesus' body missing. The Gospels kind of differ with what happened next. The Gospel of Mark's version is especially interesting when you reach this part of the story. Mark 16 states, "The 3 women, one of whom is Mary Magdalene, find a young man clothed in a long white robe sitting, and they get freaked out. He says, 'Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, as he said to you.'" It is generally interpreted that this man in white is an angel or a messenger of God, who tells the women that Jesus is alive in the region of Galilee, and they should tell Jesus' disciples of what they have found and pursue him. Mark 16 verse 8 concludes with, "So they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." Apparently, they, the women, do not listen to God's instructions and do not tell their fellow disciples or anyone of what they saw or were told, instead keeping it a secret. Now, here's where things get very, very interesting. In most modern English Bibles, Mark chapter 16 continues after verse 8. Verses 9 through 18 tell of how Jesus himself, back from the dead, appears to first Mary Magdalene. She later tells several disciples who do not believe her. Jesus then appears in front of 2 unnamed disciples who are once again not believed. Then, for a third time, Jesus appears to all of the 11 remaining apostles at a dinner. Verses 19 and 20 conclude with Jesus finally leaving, ascending into heaven, and sitting at God's right hand, concluding with the disciples going out and preaching his message and return to the world. Now, the ending of Mark's Gospel has been the source of much textual criticism and debate. Many biblical scholars have found discrepancies that call into question the authenticity of verses 9 through 20. Our oldest and most complete copies of Mark, the Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, both end at Mark 16 verse 8, with the 3 women departing from Jesus' empty tomb and the man in white, and telling no one of what they saw there. No Jesus appearing to Mary Mag, nor to the 2 disciples, nor to the 11 apostles at dinner. These manuscripts are not damaged or missing pages or anything. The story just ends there, with the scribe denoting the conclusion of the document by writing Kata Markon, or according to Mark, after verse 8, and then continuing to copy the Gospel of Luke. Nothing has been erased or removed from the documents here. It is only in later text made around or after 400 AD that we get the long ending of Mark, verses 9 through 20, seen in our modern Bibles. Once again, we are confronted with a predicament. The oldest manuscripts omit verses 9 through 20, while later ones include verses 9 through 20. There is also a rival third ending of Mark that can be found in a select few manuscripts called the short ending, which picks up after verse 8 and states that the women reported their story to Peter and Jesus appears to them. Some later manuscripts only have the long ending, some only have the short, others have a Frankenstein combination of long and short, and finally some have neither, preferring to end at verse 8. Woof, so many competing versions makes you want to pull your hair out, doesn't it? You probably are asking yourself which one was the original ending of the Gospel of Mark. Most scholars agree that verses 9 through 20, that is, the long ending, was almost definitely not a part of the original text of Mark, but a later addition, a J.K. Rowling insertion, if you will. Many aspects, such as the language and style of the verses, as well as all our oldest texts omitting them, support this theory. Most have concluded something similar about the short ending, which only appears in a select few later manuscripts. Now, scholars debate what the original ending of Mark might have been, if it wasn't the long or short endings. Some suggest that a fourth, as of yet unknown ending, after verse 8 has been lost to history. However, others suggest that the Gospel of Mark very well might have originally ended at verse 8, with the other endings being tacked on by scribes centuries later. This changes everything, if true. When one reads the versions of Mark that end at verse 8, it actually makes one's retroactive view of the gospel very sad. In this version, nobody knows that Jesus has risen from the dead, because the women don't say anything, because they were afraid. And then it just ends. It's ambiguous, ominous, and abrupt, and sticks with the reader. It's a massive cliffhanger, and raises so many questions. The reader is left to ask, if the women didn't say anything to anyone, and thus nobody was able to pursue Jesus in Galilee, how did the disciples ever learn of the resurrection? Did they even learn? Was what the mysterious man in white said even true? We don't know. The author doesn't tell us. In this version, we don't actually see Jesus alive after his crucifixion, just the empty tomb. We are simply told of it and left to wonder what happened next. Some might shout, how could that be the ending? But researchers have pointed out that this abrupt ending is actually very in line with the themes and motifs of Mark. In Mark, unlike with the other Gospels, many people, even Jesus' followers, repeatedly do not listen to his or God's instructions. The disciples on several occasions just don't seem to get it, and do not understand Jesus' sayings, sometimes to his aggravation. The abrupt ending very well might be a callback to the beginning of Mark, where Jesus heals the leper, and he orders him not to tell anyone about it, but the man does not listen and tells the whole city. Perhaps ironically, the author is pointing out that when God orders people to do the opposite, proclaim and spread his word, they choose once again to disobey and stay silent, leaving the reader with an impactful, punch-in-the-gut moral lesson about obedience. Later scribes, perhaps missing this message, could not handle this abrupt and somewhat uncomfortable ending to the gospel, and thus added the 12 verses we see in our modern Bibles. Whatever the reasons for their additions were, we can be pretty certain that the ending or endings seen in our modern English Bibles is not the original, and was an intentional change.
أخي يا مقيما شمالا جنوب تجوب الأخوة قلبي تجوب وتهتف بي نحو دار الخلود فدرب الأخوة خير الدروب.